stuff in a temple context. Divine chariots are also known from other sources, and here's some Mesopotamian ones, where you can see the strange winged figure is pulling the chariot, and then you can see the gods and so forth associated with that. You got a four-wheeled one up on top, a two-wheeled one at the bottom. And there's some very nice descriptions of chariots used, god chariots that were made by Sumerians, and they had them in their temples in the Gudea inscriptions. I've given some sources there where you can find more details on that. I don't have time to go into that, but that's another possible parallel in that context. So, next parallel is Ezekiel is describing a wheeled vehicle of some sort, and possibly linked, or probably linked in my view, to the cherub chariot or the chariot of the sun that is described in being in the temple. Now there's another characteristic of Ezekiel's description, that there's a throne involved in this. Now there's a rakia, or a dome, or a firmament in the King James Version above these chariots, and they're holding it up apparently, or it's somehow associated with them. And then on top of this is a throne. And of course the throne of God concept is central to the Holy of Holies, that the mercy seat, this is God's throne and so forth, associated with the temple. So we've got a possible connection there. This is an interesting artistic source of what they might be thinking about. This is from a few centuries after Ezekiel, but is probably a chariot throne with a god sitting on it. It says Yahud in the coin, so it's maybe Jewish, maybe pagan associated with it. But at any rate, how to exactly interpret it is a question. All right, so we've got then also the throne of God associated with both the Merkabah and the Holy of Holies. So this is leading to my first speculation that the Merkabah is a wheeled Holy of Holies. It's a portable Holy of Holies that you can move around. Now, Holy of Holies is probably the earthly representation of the real thing, which is the celestial one, and that's what Ezekiel's seeing. I mean, it's the earthly one is the pure imitation of the real thing. Another aspect of this, however, is that I think we've got a lot of astronomical symbolism involved in this chariot, and we'll take a look at some of the things in that regard here. One example we already briefly alluded to was the fact that Ezekiel describes the cherubs as carrying a rakia, or a firmament, or a dome is probably a better translation from the NRSV. It's over their heads, it's above them. Now this term is precisely the same term found in Genesis 1:6 for the dome of heavens. There's this rakia, this big arched dome, and God's throne is sometimes described as being up on top of this. Now rakia can be other things. It's not exclusively a technical term for this, but you may have an astronomical connection in this regard, that that there's a dome representing the heavens and that type of thing. There's also Near Eastern examples of cherub-like creatures bearing divine beings. Now this one is from the Achaemenid period, a Persian. Here you've got God, probably a Ahura Mazda in a Persian context, and here you've got strange creatures with the feet of bulls, which is how Ezekiel describes the cherubs. They've got four wings, and they're raising their arms, and they're holding up Ahura Mazda. So probably they're dealing with something along those lines. Here's a 14th century example from Megiddo, where you've got numerous creatures holding up what I would say is the heavens. I mean, and what they're holding you can debate, it's, of course. But you've got multiple faces on this one. This one looks to me like an eagle, but who knows? This one has bull-like with the horns. This one down here, there's human ones, and so forth. And then these composite creatures with wings. So something along those lines is probably what Ezekiel is describing here. So first astronomical symbol is that there's a firmament, or a rakia, associated with this vehicle. We've also got the chariots. Now, elsewhere in Jewish scripture, in the Psalms, the Lord is described as riding a chariot on the wings of the wind, and then he's also described as riding a cherub on the wings of the wind, exactly parallel ideas. So you've got cherub and chariot overlapping here in this particular case, but the question is, what type of chariot? What is this chariot supposed to represent? Now, we've already seen this slide before, but you've got wheels mentioned in these types of things, chariot of the cherubim here, but here it's called a chariot of the sun. Now, this is in 2 Kings. Of course, it may be describing three different things. I'm conflating them, right? It's quite possible that the chariot of the sun was one thing, the golden chariot of the cherubim was another thing, and Ezekiel's chariots is something entirely different. But we do have this tradition of a solar chariot attached to the temple, once in its construction and once in the destruction of this chariot. And if the cherubim chariot and the solar chariot are the same, then we've got this astronomical symbolism. So it's possible then we've got a solar motif in this. We also have a strange thing called the wheelwork. Now this is Galgal in Hebrew, and what this is again, much of this stuff is obscure in Ezekiel. And it doesn't help it to read it in Hebrew, it just makes it worse to understand. It's much better to read it in translation because at least the translators made it clear, right? What Ezekiel's talking about is often obscure, but it's very evocative, even though not clear. But he talks about these wheels, he talks about wheels within wheels, and then he calls them a galgal, which translates wheelwork in NRSV. I've listed several different passages in Ezekiel where he talks about this. Now, what specifically that is, of course, can be debated. But galgal, this root, refers in a sense to a skull. It can be a wheel, but it can also be a spherical thing. So, in other words, it's skull-shaped. And that would indicate to me a possibility of a sphere. And if you've got a wheel within a wheel, in this particular case, this is a Christian piece of art, much later, but it shows you one conceptualization of this, that there's one wheel this way and the other wheel this way, and then combined together they form two wheels hooked together forming a sphere. Now, whether that's what Ezekiel intended, of course, we can be debated, but that's one possible optional interpretation of this. However, if we turn to later Jewish sources, and this is 1,000 years after Ezekiel and maybe a completely different tradition, but you've got examples, I'm going to show you three, of solar figures on chariots surrounded by wheels within wheels. And these are the Zodiac Mosaics from Jewish synagogues from the 4th through the 6th century in northern Israel. So this one's from Tiberias. This is one of the earliest ones. And it's damaged by later constructions on top of it, but you can see wheels within wheels. You see these circles. Ezekiel talks about eyes on the wheels and stuff. And then you've got a figure here who's clearly a solar figure. He's got the halo and the 7 beams, solar beams on top. And notice he's holding in his hand a sphere of some sort. Probably the moon, but I mean, what exactly it is can be debated. This slide shows a little closer. And you've got these figures, lions and other bulls and things like that associated with the figures Ezekiel describes. And then you've got this figure up close with the beams of suns off his head and then holding, I guess, a lunar sphere. At any rate, you've got then these exemplars of the wheel within wheel idea. Here you've got another one. This one's a little bit hard to see. This was a brand new discovered one a few years ago in Sepphoris, or Zippuri in northern Israel. And here you've got the wheel, here you've got another wheel. And then in this, you've got a chariot figure, but instead of showing a human form, which is what Ezekiel describes and what the Tiberias one has, you have a pillar with a sun disk on it. This is a close-up of that. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the slide with it, but there's a sun disk right here, the beams coming off in all directions, riding in a solar chariot. Now, these are, in one sense, pagan illustrations of Apollo riding his solar chariot. I mean, you can find earlier examples of exactly these type of things, but read within the context of Ezekiel, we might be seeing something along those lines. The Beit Alpha one is interesting here. This is 6th century. It's got exactly the same stuff. The artist was obviously someone with my skills instead of the skills of somebody like Michael Lyon in terms of art, but you've got the figure, you've got the solar burst off his head, you've got the sun, the moon, and the stars represented here. He's riding a chariot. He's surrounded by wheels within wheels. And the 4 figures representing the seasons are winged, just as the cherubims are described, as being these winged creatures forming the 4 corners. So the other here's showing them all together, just so you can see. This was a common motif in late antique synagogues. Now this solar figure, just to show you what we're talking about, this is Apollo. This one is presumably the Lord, but maybe just the sun in the Tiberias. And this one, who's this? This is Jesus. One of the earliest depictions we have of Jesus is riding a solar chariot with the 7 beams of the sun off his head. This is from the Vatican grottos right around 300. And as I said, it's one of the very earliest depictions we have of Jesus. So, this wheelwork, I'm suggesting, is symbolic of the planetary spheres, possibly.